you may be aware of some news that broke this morning. This is Peter van Valkenburg. He's going to tell us about the news, what it means, and why we should be concerned about it, I guess. So please give a warm welcome to Peter van Valkenburg from Coin Center.
Thanks, Jack. So thanks for sticking around. I know you didn't maybe expect to see me again, but it's been a hell of a day from a legal policy standpoint for privacy rights. So in brief, I'm going to go over what's happened, and then we'll have a little time at the end for questions on the Discord, which Jack will moderate. So first, I'm Peter van Valkenburg. I'm the Director of Research at Coin Center. Coin Center is an independent nonprofit that's here to defend the rights of people who are building or using permissionless blockchain networks. We've been doing that since 2014, and we're going to keep doing it. So OFAC. OFAC stands for the Office of Foreign Asset Control. It's a division within Treasury. Treasury has a lot of divisions. We talked a little bit yesterday about FinCEN, which sets policy for things like anti-money laundering, KYC for MSBs. OFAC is a different part of Treasury that sets policy with regard to sanctions, economic sanctions. And the big thing that OFAC does, among other things, is create this list of specially designated nationals. It's called the SDN list, Specially Designated Nationals List. This is a list of persons who are suspected of supporting terrorism or enemy states, who should therefore be denied access to the US financial system, and with whom Americans should not transact or materially offer support. So it's pretty heavy-duty stuff. The first big question to ask here is, who has to do OFAC compliance? In other words, who has to look at that OFAC list periodically to make sure they're not accidentally buying or deliberately buying the assets of someone who's a known terrorist? Well, the answer to that is everyone. All Americans are technically obligated to obey sanctions law, which means they need to check the list to make sure that whoever they're transacting with isn't on it. And so this is sort of materially different than other conversations that we have in the legal policy space and the civil liberties space, like who needs to register as a money transmitter. Who needs to register as a money transmitter is a question of the Bank Secrecy Act, and it's interpreted by FinCEN, this other division of Treasury, and that's where things like the custodial versus non-custodial distinctions in their guidance in 2019 are relevant. This is not about whether you have custody of customer funds. This is about you acting on your behalf and whether you happen to be transacting with a specially designated national who's been sanctioned by OFAC. So everyone technically has to do this. And that is also very interesting from a legal and civil rights perspective because it's a strict liability statute. So you can have criminal liability for violating OFAC by transacting with one of these designated nationals. And they don't even necessarily need to prove that you had an intent or knowledge of the fact that you were transacting with one of these sanctions parties. The mere fact, strict liability, that you made that transaction can subject you to criminal liability. And so this has very real, sort of questions and quandaries about due process and about the rule of law in this context. So that's the necessary throat-clearing background. What happened this morning? Well, early this morning, as I said, it's been a really fun day for me. The OFAC and the Treasury announced, they put out a press release that they were adding Tornado Cash to the SDN list, which means you can't transact with Tornado Cash if you're an American and you're obeying sanctions laws. So what does that mean? So the actual item in the SDN list that was announced, and you can see it in the list now, is an identification of a URL and a series of smart contract addresses, at least some of which are, I would say, immutable. We'll get into that topic in a second. And this is the sanctioned party, this list of some 45 Ethereum addresses. Rather than it being the alias of some person or business who is sanctioned, really this list is a list of Ethereum addresses. And so this, to me, is a bit of a sea change in the way we've done OFAC policy in this country, at least since I started working at Coin Center in 2014. And it's not a good one from a civil liberties standpoint, and I'm very concerned. So let's compare this, adding these 45 Ethereum addresses to the SDN list, to past things in the crypto space. So in 2018, for the first time ever, Bitcoin addresses appeared in the SDN list. these were Bitcoin addresses that were used by 2 Iranians who were involved in a ransomware scheme. And so Iran is a sanctioned country, and these people are engaged in a criminal act to support a sanctioned country. And so, of course, I think, not debating the relative merit of sanctions as a tool for foreign policy, I think it makes sense, though, that what we're doing is identifying individuals and saying, you're not supposed to transact with these individuals, and these are the associated accounts and addresses on the Bitcoin network, where if you sent money to that address, you would be sending money to that sanctioned person, so you should not make transactions with those addresses. So to me, this is a fairly non-controversial application of the sanctions laws, setting aside whether you believe sanctions laws are the right way to do foreign policy. In May of 2022, so just this past year, this past spring, for the first time, OFAC added a cryptocurrency mixer service. This was Blender.io to the SDN list. Now, how is that different than what's happening right now? Well, when they identified Blender.io, they identified an unincorporated organization, a series of names and aliases, a website, a .onion address, an email address, lots of other things, and a series of Bitcoin addresses that were relevant to using the Blender.io mixer service. Now, this is an unincorporated entity, so it's not as if we're saying these are the properties of some specific person, but it is a specific entity with real people behind it. They just apparently hadn't been identified at this point when they were added to the SDN list. And the reason this is fundamentally different than the Tornado Cash situation is that in that case, Blender.io was a custodial centralized Bitcoin mixer. Every one of those addresses on that list had a private key that controlled movement out of that address. So if you sent money to be mixed, someone's got control of it, the person who has the private key, and they're going to mix funds in that account and give you a transaction back to preserve your privacy in a really technically lousy way, as we all know, being people who study zero-knowledge proofs and better systems, but as a way to maintain privacy on Bitcoin. And so in this case, we're still talking about a sanction that's directed at people or persons, whoever those persons are that control those private keys, that control those Bitcoin addresses, who are knowingly laundering money for criminal enterprises. And also, I would add, because they're a custodial mixer, they're really not any different than a centralized exchange like Coinbase or Kraken. Money comes into an omnibus wallet, and it goes out from an omnibus wallet depending on the wishes of the people using the service. And so if you're a custodial centralized exchange or a custodial mixer, under FinCEN's rules for money services businesses, you're technically obligated to register, just like PayPal and Venmo have to register because they control people's money. And so they had never registered. So they had already clearly violated the law in another regard, apart from sanctions law. I would say a bad actor, allegedly, if the facts in that case were true. So now we move on to Tornado Cash, the announcement this morning. In this case, the entity being sanctioned is not described thoroughly whatsoever. There's no email address. There's nothing mentioned. All that's mentioned is the following: Tornado Cash, AKA Tornado Cash Classic, AKA Tornado Cash Nova, website tornado.cash, and then a series of some 45 Ethereum smart contract addresses with no additional guidance as to whether it's about the people behind those contracts or it's just those contracts. And so unlike in the Blender.io case, Tornado Cash is a non-custodial mixing software. It's instantiated on the Ethereum blockchain at these various smart contracts, and the funds which you may send to those addresses, though I wouldn't recommend it now if you're an American, are not controlled by some person who's holding a private key. The funds are controlled by the software logic that's described in open source software libraries and is executed on the Ethereum blockchain. And so if you pay that address, which I think would make you in violation of sanctions laws, you're not paying a sanctioned individual. You're not buying the property or assets of a sanctioned individual. You are not even interacting with the intellectual property of a sanctioned individual, not really, because the logic of that smart contract code is open source, non-proprietary. It would be like saying, well, we know North Korean terrorists who are hackers use Linux, so Americans shouldn't use Linux. They should use Microsoft. It's absurd. to basically make this claim that by virtue of the fact that this software exists in the world and we don't like what it's doing, Americans shouldn't be able to use it, and we should enforce that by sanctioning the software itself. And I don't want to make an absolute claim here, but looking at the smart contracts in these addresses, many, if not most of them, have the operator power burned in such a way that it cannot be recovered by anyone. And the operators that remain and retain some power on other contracts mentioned in this list of addresses, to my knowledge, can't control existing user funds. So to my knowledge, this looks truly non-custodial, as in, if I'm sending money to these addresses, I'm not paying an individual, sanctioned or not. And credit to Michael Llewellyn at Open Zeppelin, who helped me out by looking at some of these addresses. He's giving a talk tomorrow about decentralized governance, of all things, that you should attend. So let's look at this one more time. In this case, rather than a person or entity being the target of sanctions, and aliases or properties of that foreign national being listed in the SDN, we have a list of properties, the Ethereum smart contract addresses, many of which are not actually in the control of anyone, not a foreign national, not a US person, not a known terrorist or an enemy state. Now, it's true that North Korean hackers have used Tornado Cash in order to launder funds from ransomware attacks, but those hackers are just one of several users of this privacy software. And they have been separately sanctioned because, again, sanctioning an entity makes complete sense. If the hackers used Linux for their operating system and we started sanctioning the Linux kernel source code, that would be ridiculous. I think that wouldn't make sense, and arguably it also doesn't make sense to sanction open source software that resides autonomously on the Ethereum blockchain. I don't think there's a clear distinction there to be made. So why is this particularly bad from a public policy standpoint? It should be fairly obvious, but in this case, the sanction really ceases to be a ban or a limitation on some specific person who's suspected of terrorism. Instead, it is a ban on innocent Americans, on ordinary Americans, any Americans, using certain types of tools and software. And it's a ban on them using these software or these tools irrespective of whether those Americans are using those tools for legal purposes. As the recent ECC slogan I've seen on some t-shirts, which I really like, says, privacy is normal. As many have observed here and at past ZCon conferences, if we're really going to use blockchains to do a lot of important business, maybe all of our important financial transactions, we absolutely are going to need privacy-enhancing technology like the zero-knowledge proofs and open source software libraries that undergird both Zcash and Tornado Cash. So, this basically is the beginning of a very real attempt to ban specific uses of open source software for protecting privacy, even for people who are doing it for all the right reasons. Also, and this gets more to the core of CoinCenter's work, which is more legal policy, there are some very real due process and First Amendment issues at stake here. So first, there are the statutory law arguments. This would be an argument that says that Treasury has overstepped the bounds set by Congress when they passed the relevant sanction laws in the way they are using sanctions in this case. And I will say first that these are very broadly drafted laws. So this might not be a smart legal avenue, but we should pursue all legal avenues to challenge this, I think. So if you're a lawyer looking at this, or you're someone who actually likes to read laws, you should be looking at the IEEPA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, and the associated executive orders that enact it and allow Treasury to issue sanctions. But the thing is, they're typically, they apply to persons or businesses, the way these laws are drafted, and their associated property. And so again, it's unusual to bend the statute to do something like sanction property that exists outside of anyone's control. And that's kind of self-evident or obvious because the drafters of this statute didn't imagine property outside of anyone's control, because blockchains are weird, man, but they're real. Also, it's worth looking at some amendments to that law, specifically the Berman amendments, which were carve-outs for First Amendment protected activities to make sure that sanctions laws didn't become overbearing and burden too much speech. So that's an avenue of potentially challenging the act of adding to the SDN list using the statute. The thing is, though, challenging it on statutory grounds is going to be hard because courts tend to give very strong deference to the executive branch's interpretation of Congress's laws in the context of national security issues. Courts are kind of like, whatever the executive says goes, we're not going to interfere here and say that they misinterpreted Congress's laws. And so I think it's likely that the challenge that is ultimately brought by folks in the space will have to hinge on constitutional law issues, arguments that this is an unconstitutional restriction on your freedom of speech, on your right of expression. So what does that look like? Again, banning software publication is banning speech. We talked about this yesterday, C. Bernstein versus US DOJ. Banning otherwise legal transactions made to maintain one's own privacy and engage in anonymous speech for political purposes is also unconstitutional under the money is speech doctrines established in Buckley v. Vallejo and Citizens United. And even laws that unreasonably chill speech are constitutionally suspect and can be challenged even before enforcement. See Americans for Prosperity versus Bonta. And I will add as a footnote here, if you've looked at the news today, several developers who have worked on software associated with the Tornado Cash protocol have had their GitHub accounts shut down. Now, if that's a business decision of GitHub, the First Amendment isn't necessarily relevant, but I don't think that's just a pure business decision of GitHub. I think basically we are looking right at the chilling effect of an unconstitutional restriction on speech and the collateral consequences, which is people stop publishing interesting ideas, maybe even can't publish interesting ideas because no one will publish them for them. Very real chilling effect. Finally, banning marketplaces for buying and selling information or data. That's actually also unconstitutional. See IMS Health versus Sorrell. This is about prescription drug detailers who try to find out what doctors are prescribing, and if they're not prescribing the right drugs, they tell the prescription drug manufacturers, and the prescription drug manufacturers go and show up in their office, and they're just like, hey, you really should try that Xanax. So this is like the height of commercial speech. You'd think if there was anything that didn't warrant protection for being expressive, that might be it. But the court in Sorrell said, no, speech is speech. Doesn't matter if it's commercial, doesn't matter if it's things like data or information. You can't put a prior restraint on speech. So under the typical operation of OFAC sanctions, the state builds a case against the target, like the two Iranians whose Bitcoin addresses were listed in the SDN list. Their names were also listed. And that's typically important because they have to build a case against those people. Now, building that case happens in secret because this is about national security according to standards that are, I believe, classified. So you don't have strong due process or rule of law protections here, but at the very least, that person retains the right to challenge the sanction. Who has the right to challenge a sanction that's made against an autonomous smart contract? Unless we're recognizing smart contracts as legal persons now, which is silly. So maybe no one can challenge it. But that's a huge problem because it means the ban can't be challenged. And yet every American is still liable if they use the software or receive a transaction from the software, which they wouldn't even be able to prevent or reject or block because that's the way blockchains like Ethereum operate. Hence why lots of people are asking if OFAC has an Ethereum address that they could send some money to. It's a good way to damage your enemies right now would be to send them ETH through Tornado Cash. And it would also be a good way to maybe give them standing, legal standing, to challenge the listing in court. So that's my summary of what just happened this morning and some of the legal implications. It's rapidly evolving, and Coin Center is going to continue its work to defend people's civil liberties, even given these new developments, especially given these new developments. So if we have a little time left, yeah, we've got 10 minutes left for questions on the Discord.
There's plenty of questions. There are a lot of questions.
I may not give you satisfying answers because this is about as much as I'm ready to say publicly, but we'll go for it.
You've already covered some of them, but I think one of the first ones is how worried should the Zcash community be about this event, and what can we do?
I think the Zcash community, really anyone in any of the cryptocurrency projects should be pretty worried at this point because of what I said about how this is sort of a sea change. This isn't we're criminalizing or attempting to ban people paying a specific person, i.e. the Iranians with Bitcoin addresses. This is, we're adding to the list of people who strict liability, criminal liability, you can't pay, an entire protocol for paying yourself, paying your friends, completely innocent transactions. I think it's a change.
Okay. Do you think that this represents a sea change or a deliberate change in approach on the part of the regulators and the part of Treasury, or do you think that this is? Do you think they maybe haven't really thought through the full ramifications of what they've done today?
So that's very hard to know, and as a rule, I try not to psychoanalyze regulators. I think it could be either. I think if you look at the Blender.io addition to the SDN list, you've got a fairly straightforward situation where people really were paying these people because they controlled the private keys that were able to do the mixing. And these people were supporting terrorists, supporting ransomware issuers and hackers and things like this. And so in that case, it was fairly obvious to use the sanctions laws to stop those payments to those people. And so if you didn't understand the difference between Tornado Cash and Blender.io, maybe you would go into this thinking, well, we're just sanctioning another mixer. And so I don't know to what extent there is confusion about those two technologies in the offices where these rulings are coming from. I do know that FinCEN is not confused about those two technologies. In fact, in their 2019 guidance for who is a money services business in this space, they actually made a clear distinction between anonymizing software providers who are not MSBs and anonymizing service providers, i.e. custodial mixers, who are MSBs. So there are people in the government who are extremely smart and understand these important differences in the technology, but it may not be all of the people who matter all the time, because government's a lot of people.
This is a question that I think the answer is obvious to some people, but absolutely not to others. Is there a limit for OFAC? What if I unknowingly send a tiny amount of ZEC to a North Korean?
Yeah, this is an interesting thing about OFAC. There is no de minimis limitation. There's no knowledge requirement. There's no intent requirement. There's prosecutorial discretion. And that almost always exists. Basically, the DOJ or OFAC or Treasury could carefully pick its victims and say, these are the people who are sending a lot of money to people on the SDN list, and we're not going to go after someone who's sort of accidentally sent a tiny bit and they thought they were supporting academic research or something like that. But that's not how the rule of law is supposed to work. You're not supposed to just rely on the goodwill of a prosecutor not to slam you with criminal felony liability for something that was actually benign. If it's benign, it shouldn't be illegal.
What should a US person do if they receive a transaction from a sanctioned address?
Yeah, that's the hardest part, because the way blockchains work is different than the way, I was just talking with Hudson earlier, check cashing works. Like, neither of us have received a check in the mail from North Korean hackers. But if we did, I don't think we'd cash that check. Because at that point, your bank's going to pull from their bank and you've engaged in a transaction with them. With Ethereum, of course, if you find out my address, because maybe I've been selling NFTs or something like that, because I'm a digital artist. I don't love NFTs, but maybe that's what you're doing. And your address is public, well, then anyone can send you funds, potentially through Tornado Cash. And at that point, you've received these transactions from a sanctioned address. You are facially in violation of the law. And again, there's no intent requirement, so it doesn't matter that you didn't intend to accept the transaction. It doesn't even matter if you know that you got the transaction. Someone should show up with a blockchain explorer and be like, hey, look, this is your address, right? And you're like, wow, someone sent me a lot of money. I wasn't even watching that address. And then they arrest you. Hopefully that doesn't happen to any of you, though.
Could the government require Ethereum miners or the Ethereum Foundation to take action to prevent transactions that are being sent to these addresses from being added to the Ethereum blockchain?
So miners is maybe the less hard question. If I was mining in the USA, I would use Chainalysis, their live feed of the SDN list, and I would just set my node to not put those transactions in blocks probably. And that makes me kind of upset from a censorship resistance and building permissionless network standpoint, but I'm not going to tell anyone that they can just go around and not worry about OFAC. It would be irresponsible of me to say that in a public place. Now, not all miners are in the US and not all of them are subject to our sanctions laws, so that's not necessarily yet sort of the death of these networks being permissionless. And I'll leave it at that. Software development, like the Ethereum Foundation you mentioned, or any of the foundations that pay devs to build open source protocols and assumedly don't do much else, let's just leave it at that for now. That might be a bit safer in the sense that merely providing open source software is going to have this robust First Amendment defense. And you're not actually, when you publish a library, you're not transacting with someone on the OFAC list, unless GitHub gets added to the OFAC list, which they're being very careful not to get added by closing down everyone's repositories and deleting their accounts.
The developers themselves did not appear on the sanctions list. What would the implications be if the core devs and founders were listed?
That I don't know, and I wouldn't want to speculate about. Interestingly, there's a lot of addresses that ostensibly might be associated with Tornado Cash that weren't in that list. That list seems to be just a cut and paste from Etherscan, the sort of obvious addresses associated with the non-custodial mixing protocol. So I don't know.
Do you see this as a failure of advocacy efforts? Sorry.
Have I failed?
I'm just repeating the questions.
I mean, yes. To be perfectly honest, it's been our mission since 2014 to make sure that the right people in government understand this technology. So going back to our earlier question, we don't know whether the people who have promulgated this order, whether they I can't say for sure whether they know the difference between a custodial and a non-custodial mixer, and whether they've gone into this with the intent to target non-custodial mixers, or whether they think they're targeting a custodial mixer. And so that would be a failure of advocacy and education efforts that Coin Center and the DeFi Education Fund and others have been trying to do. I would say it's a hard job, given especially the somewhat Byzantine nature of American government, where there are several agencies. And I would say I think some of our education efforts have borne fruit, for example, in FinCEN's distinctions between custodial and non-custodial entities. But we can always do more. We probably should do more.
What can be done about this specific situation? Like, I guess there's two parts to that question. What can members of the Zcash community do? You know, we had a great talk yesterday from Kurt. He talked about, you know, making your voices heard through representatives and so on. Is that worth pursuing? And then what can, you know, organizations like Coin Center do?
Yeah. So I'm going to give the unsatisfying answer right now of stay tuned, follow Coin Center, at Coin Center on Twitter, follow Fight for the Future, follow the Electronic Frontier Foundation. We're going to come up with a game plan, either individually or together, and there may be things like calls to action. There may be things like call your congressman. It's premature to do that now. Sometimes it's better to work within the system before you get into sort of louder protests. And I will say that, I mean, it was probably evident from my sort of liturgy of First Amendment case law, someone is going to have to bring, I think, a challenge defending people's First Amendment rights to the extent they're jeopardized by this order.
Just a final question, and this is from me personally. You know, in the past, we've talked about regulating activities rather than technology. And you've just talked about sanctioning individuals or legal entities, you know, and this is the first time, I guess, you know, we could say that a technology has been sanctioned. You know, do you have any kind of thoughts or reactions about that? Like, could this be the first of many?
I mean, sanctioning a robot is pretty cypherpunk, so welcome to your cypherpunk future. That's all I got. I don't know.
Well, Peter, listen, thanks very much for being willing to come and give us your thoughts on this.